the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments onto whatever platform you might be watching on. And for most of those platforms, your comments will appear here in my chat room. I had intended to have Krys Copeland as my guest today, but unfortunately, unexpected occurrences have called her away. She will be coming on in a couple of weeks. But I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about Corellian publishing today and some of the things we're doing and looking at doing. And I hope that you will enjoy that. We've recently created a Corellian publishing book club, and the first book that we are working with, hello to Nikki Dodd in the chat room, it's good to see you, Nikki, is The Court of the Five Tribes by Laura Enright. And this is a dragon fantasy adventure novel. A bit of an epic and very atmospheric and beautiful. And if you'd like to find out more about the book club, you can find out more on our website at corellianpublishing.com. It is in the button row at the center, and it is descriptive of what all is involved in the book club. Elsewhere, as you know, we recently brought out Reverend Don's book of Stones, Metals, and Crystals. The first group of orders has been sent out and received at this point. So if you're waiting on one of those, you will have them. We have just finished revising the first degree. Lady Alyssa, the first priestess of the Corellian tradition, and myself have revised the first degree to reflect the new era and some changes in ideas, and that is available. You can find that at corellianpublishing.com. It includes much of the same material, most of the same material, because most of it is pretty permanent, but a few things have changed, including teachings about the matron goddess, which has been revised a bit to retitle the matron goddess as the queen, and to talk in a little bit more detail about it. There are a few other changes as well. So if you're interested in that, that is now available. And I'm now looking at what the next book I write will be. And I'm looking at Reverend Don's Book of Energy, which is pretty much laid out and only needs to be created at this point. Reverend Don's Book of Crystal Web Weapons and Protection for the uncertain times we live in. And I think that would be an interesting book, which I'm thinking will be either the next or the second next. And then I'm also looking at Reverend Don's Book of Wizardry. I've always written about witchcraft mostly, and comparative religion in general, but I thought I might write a little bit more on wizardry. And what do I mean by wizardry? For the purposes of this book, it would be focusing a lot more on things like Kabbalah and ceremonialism and Hermeticism and alchemy, as well as traditional wizard figures and ideas about wizardry. And I'm curious to know if any of those ideas are of particular interest to you. And if they are, please let me know. These are some of the things well, they're all things I'm planning to write. It's just a question of the order. And of course, writing a book is never an overnight thing. Writing a pamphlet, maybe, but a book takes a little while, at least a couple of months. And that's if you know your subject well. But, I thought I might also take a few minutes to discuss what's involved in writing a book. And I've done this before, but I thought I might talk about that a little bit again. If you're an aspiring author, what do you need to do to write a book? Well, the first thing you need to do is have a subject, of course. And this can either be a subject that you know really well, which is usually the best idea, or it can be one that you have to take time to learn about. And sometimes, in fact, frequently, to write that book, you're going to have to do some research to refine your knowledge of that subject. Um, Sometimes you may find yourself starting from from scratch. Sometimes, um, pardon me for a moment. Sometimes you may find yourself um, simply refining what you already know. But even when you know a great deal about a subject, you still usually want to look up just a little bit more if you're going to try to write a book about it, because you want the book to be thorough. When I wrote Death on the Horizon of Joy, which is a murder mystery set in ancient Egypt, even though I've studied Egypt since I was a small child, there were a number of things that I wanted to learn more about before I wrote that book. Aspects of everyday life, because when you're writing a narrative, I figure the more details of everyday life you can include, the better off you're going to be. And of course, I had some idea about that, but I wanted more. So I did quite a bit of research. Um, I did a lot of research into the ancient Egyptian language insofar as it can be spoken of. Even though I already had some knowledge about that, I had a good knowledge of hieroglyphics. But being able to read and write in hieroglyphics is not the same thing as being able to create little bits of dialogue here and there. So I did quite a bit of research on that. And it made, I think, for a much more detailed, much deeper narrative. But, things you might not think about um, include, for example, the kinds of light source that were used. One of the things I often hear from people who think that the Egyptians somehow had electric light is that they did all of these tomb paintings um, in chambers that had no windows, and yet there's not a lot of soot on the ceilings. And there are several reasons for that, but one of them is that not every kind of oil lamp produces soot. And I wrote about that and why that is in in that novel. I wrote about the fact that they had lamp lighters that worked kind of like our modern lighters, except of course not on butane. They were long wicks that were lit from a fire and then carried through the house to light the lamps. But you wouldn't think of something like that if you didn't live in that era. Um, when I wrote the recent book, Reverend Don's book of stones, metals, and crystals, although I have a wide knowledge of these things and have written about them extensively before, there are things in there that I went out and researched just for this book. And that's good. Ideally, writing a book should be as educational for the author as it is for the reader in some ways. Um, Occasionally, you can just sit down and write what you already know, and that will be fine. But often you want to expand your own knowledge. And I think that's one of the more fascinating aspects of writing. Now, when you've got your knowledge, you need to have an outline. And sometimes you need to have the outline first before you do any additional research so that you know what you're going to talk about. Having an outline is vitally important, in my opinion, to creating a decent book. And it is important to put things in a sensible order. And, it can be fun to read a book that is kind of random in its order, but I think it's far more satisfying when it's been properly laid out so that everything builds on what came before. And so that you encounter things after you've been prepared for them. And you have kind of a unified rate of growth in the knowledge that's being put out. And to do that, you have to have a, um, a an order. You have to have it set into its contents so that you know how you're going to put it together. So putting that together is the next important thing that you want to do, but you also have to bear in mind that that is not necessarily what you're going to end up with when you're done. You want to set out the order that you're going to do the book in, but then you need to let it take the shape it's going to take. So, for example, when I did the degree lessons, I started each of them by creating the template of what lesson was going to be what. But in several cases, as I progressed through it, I did change the order in which the lessons appeared, or sometimes changed what the lesson was going to be when I realized there was something else that needed to be discussed. More often, it was the collateral parts, like the exercises, that got moved around or changed. And hello to Magical Mermaid, and hello to Mary in the chat room. It's good to see you. And being able to change the table of contents that you start with is very important, because you'll find inspiration may change the order that you want to approach the material in. You may find there are things you did not initially think of that will be suggested by the process of writing. When you've done that, then you need to sit down and actually write it. And the best way to do that really is to write a little bit every day, or as many days in a row as possible. And even if you're not feeling inspired on that particular day, it's good to go ahead and write, because one, you may become inspired, and two, you can always rewrite it the next day if you find out that you're not really happy with it. But having a momentum and keeping that momentum can be very important. It is sometimes going to happen that you'll hit a block in writing, and sometimes you just have to go away and do something else for a while. When I wrote Death on the Horizon of Joy, I got about 2/3 of the way through the story, and I found myself blocked. And I went and did other things, and life got very busy, and 5 years later, I came back and started over from the beginning. And the result of that was a much better finished work. But this happens sometimes when you're writing, and in between, several other things were written before I came back to my only published novel. Not my only novel, but my only published novel. Writing a book is a huge undertaking in most cases. What I found helpful, and what I still do, particularly with Death on the Horizon of Joy, where I was trying to replicate more of a spoken voice, but in many different instances, is to write it and then to read it and see if it flows naturally when I'm reading it. And I've sometimes found that caused me to rephrase things in a better way. Generally speaking, people say that you should make a rough draft and then go back and polish it. And I do that sometimes, and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I simply polish it as I go. But always you want to be open to changing that first thing you've put down. One of the things I found this first in doing the first degree lessons. And it was Ed the Pagan who pointed out to me that I needed to bear in mind that the audience that I was hoping for were not people who had a background in Wicca or paganism. That I was looking for people who were wanting to learn because it was first degree and wouldn't know certain terms. And he was absolutely right. I had not. At that point, we were 20 years past my own first degree. And I had been raised in a family practicing Correllianism. Um, I'd always had those terms. I really had to think about, how do I present this to someone who doesn't know um, some of these things? How do I make it accessible? And I went back and rewrote a lot of things for that reason. And I've kept that in mind ever since. That I am a believer in the idea that if every now and then somebody has to go and get a thesaurus to understand um, some of the words that you've written, this is not a bad thing. Because I myself love to come across words that are unfamiliar to me, though it doesn't happen very often. Um, but I also feel you need to keep what you're writing accessible. And also make sure you're saying what you want to say. Make sure that what you're saying is sufficiently carefully worded, particularly in an instructional manual, that the reader will understand what you have meant to say. One of the things I've often liked to refer to is that passage in First Degree where I talk about um, how traditionally many altars were made out of doors. This is because I tend to speak in a more old-fashioned way because I'm an older person. And if I talk about being outside in nature, I'm more likely to talk about being out of doors than simply being outdoors, which is a more modern way of putting it. However, a lot of people wrote to me to ask what kind of doors they should be making their altars from. This was a very important lesson about clarity in writing. And I often argue with computer grammar programs who um, I think are trying to make things too simplified. However, it is still a good thing to be doing. Um, Even if I think you need to be careful of oversimplifying and dumbing things down too far for people. And hello to Reverend Michael in the chat room. And Magical Mermaid says, perfection takes a lot of missteps and errors to get there. Yes, it does. And this is a very important point. I come from the point of view that making mistakes is how you get your education. There's nothing wrong with making mistakes along the way, as long as you're learning from them. And so when I give that example of the altars made out of doors, um, I'm not sorry that I did that. I'm glad that I learned from it, which has also given me occasion to talk about the fact that some people do make altars out of doors. And if you have the room for it, a door can make a very interesting altar table. And and Mary says, I just moved on. I didn't have room in my tiny home for an altar made from a door. And, at some point, I should write a more detailed treatise on that subject because making an altar out of a door is an interesting concept. It certainly is not common. Making an altar from a window is also an interesting concept and very, very popular in African traditional religion, where ancestor altars are often made from windows on the premise that the ancestral spirits are, in a manner of speaking, regarding you from a window in the spirit realm, and you're regarding them from a window in this realm. That the window represents that barrier that you're communicating through. And Lady Alyssa, whom I mentioned earlier, has a beautiful altar made in that way for the ancestors. Magical Mermaid says you could use artwork with an image of a door. Yes, you could. You absolutely could. And in a manner of speaking, you're using an altar as a door. But that doesn't change the fact that what I originally meant to say was that traditionally it was common to make altars outside. Um, and that you have to be careful of what you're saying. And, people often say things they don't mean to say. One of the things I also included in First Degree, which was a little snarky of me, is I referenced the American Council of Witches, who had made the comment that they endorsed the rule of harm none, and that it was not subject to um, interpretation. And I endorse that and tend to stand by that, that it's not subject to interpretation but must be taken as it's stated, on the understanding that we all understand what harm means in ordinary conversation. You cannot take that and reinterpret the word harm in um, some universal manner that goes beyond what it's normally understood to mean and still have the idea of harm none have any meaning. The truth is, I believe the American Council of Witches spoke sloppily and did not actually mean at all what that statement says. They were interpreting it very broadly. But their statement that it should not be interpreted is what I agree with, that you must take it as it stands. We know, I've heard people object to the idea of harm none on the premise that um, you can't even really breathe without destroying occasional microbes and so forth. That you can't let your house be overrun with cockroaches and whatnot, rather than harm a bug. But that's not what the word harm was ever meant to apply to. If you're not wildly overinterpreting it, the term harm none does not apply to anything like that. Um, but if you ask me what they originally meant when they said that, I don't think it's at all what I mean when I say it. So it was a little snarky of me to comment on it. But you have to consider how people are going to take something. And I figured I would be there to explain what I meant, as I just did, that you must use the term as you understand the term in daily conversation. Um, there are so many things this applies to, and it's not uncommon, if you look around, that you'll find people who have taken some comment out of context, married themselves to it, and gone in completely the wrong direction because they didn't understand exactly what was said because it wasn't said carefully enough. Therefore, if you read my works very often, you'll find that I'm very cautious in how I phrase things. And sometimes that may seem a little formal, but it's because I realize if it's not, you could come away with a different meaning than what I intend. Um, you'll often find it repetitive for that same reason. I want to make sure that the reader has understood what I'm actually trying to say. This is especially true in the degree lessons, where it's repetitive because it's teaching material. It's repetitive so that you continue to be exposed to the idea. You don't just see it once. Now, in addition to all of that, in accessibility in my writing, I also tend to write highly patterned materials. What do I mean by that? Patterning was a term that Lady Bitterwind used to refer to artwork and writing that is meant to be taken on many levels. It has the surface meaning that's obvious, and then symbolic meanings that can be added onto that can go in many directions and aren't necessarily going to be noticed at first. And a lot of my writing is that way too. I've had people tell me they reread the degree materials on a regular basis because every time they find new material in it that they missed the last time, which does not surprise me at all because it was written that way. A lot of my books are that way. Not everything was meant to be gotten on the first reading. Um, if you're a careful reader, as I am, you may get it on the first reading. But there are a lot of things in there that are not right on the surface, as well as the things that are. So on one hand, I made it very accessible. On the other hand, I left lots of room for digging. And that's how I like things to be. And I find it very fascinating when I go back to something that I have been familiar with and see something I had not previously seen. And I find that that has to do with the expansion of consciousness. And I think that those people who make it a habit to regularly reread the degree materials find more material there that they did not initially notice because their consciousness has expanded enough to make it more obvious in some cases. For example, in first degree, we talk about some very profound concepts in passing. When you have read second and third and you go back and read that again, you will understand it a little better just for that reason, not to mention the difference in your experience. This is true in the main body, it's true in the exercises, and it's true for second and third degree too. Um, and it's also true in my artwork. A lot of my artwork, if you look at just what's on the surface, you'll come away usually with a narrative of some sort. But if you look deeper into it, often there's symbolism adding to that that may or may not be obvious at first glance. And, I was trained, I guess I'll say I was trained, I was educated heavily with Renaissance artwork. And that's a very Renaissance thought, that you include lots of symbolism in your artwork. So that you have, on one hand, the pretty picture, but all these things you can read into it because they expected to be sitting and looking at that painting for years. And they wanted to be able to see more things over time. And if you look at like the works of Michelangelo or Botticelli, you'll find there's lots of symbolism in there. Da Vinci, in recent years, has become very famous for that kind of symbolism. And it shows up sometimes in things you wouldn't think, like the architecture in the background. And I've been known to do that too, because it adds interesting little ideas. And I tend to try to do that also sometimes in my writing. And these are all things to think about. If you are a writer, if you think you would like to write something, there are ways to approach it that make it a much deeper process. And that's good. It is, I think, part of the joy of doing it and part of the joy of reading it. Or in the case of artwork, part of the joy of viewing it. I've talked about in first degree why I think that artwork can be better than writing for the communication of spiritual ideas. And one of them is that it communicates on so many levels, and not necessarily to the thinking mind, but directly to spirit and the emotions. And the thinking mind then interprets it. I think that when we use all of these different levels, we create a better end. So, those are my thoughts on the subject. I see that we have come toward the end of our half hour, so we want to take a moment for a word from our sponsors. Why? Because we love our sponsors. And hello, this is Rev Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse. And I would like to invite you to my Don Art showing and auction on Friday, May 9th, with original pieces and prints of my artwork and other interesting items, with the auction at 5 p.m. on Whatnot. And please stay tuned for more announcements and examples of art that will be coming. Thank you. And thank you to our sponsors, Equinox Learning Hub and the May 9th Dinart Art Show. And there will be lots of original artwork of the kind I've been describing, as well as prints of existing artwork. And I showed one of the new pieces just the other day. I think it was yesterday, might have been Monday, but there'll be more coming. And thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the show, and let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we rejoice in this walk we walk together, and we ask you to help us to enjoy the process of learning and to enjoy the process of teaching, for each of us does both of these in our lives. Help us to be a source of useful teaching throughout the world that we live in, and help us also to be constantly learning from that world that we live in. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for joining us today, and I will see you again tomorrow.